My name is Liam Porter. I'm 36 years old, and I used to think marriage was like a well-cooked lasagna. Layered, comforting, takes genuine effort, and best enjoyed piping hot with someone you actually give a damn about. What I didn't realize, what I was too blind or too stupid or too comfortable to see, was that mine had been sitting in the back of the fridge for months, getting colder and more congealed by the day. Nobody tells you that the hardest part about a failing marriage isn't the dramatic blow-ups or the thrown dishes you see in movies. It's the slow, creeping realization that you've been eating cold leftovers and convincing yourself they still taste fine. Saturdays used to be sacred in our house, and I mean that in the most suburban, beautifully mundane way possible. We'd sleep in until some ungodly hour like 9:30, which felt like noon to us because we're not 20 anymore and hangovers last 3 days now. Then we'd stumble into the kitchen, still half asleep, and attempt to make pancakes while inevitably burning at least two because one of us would get distracted arguing about which show to binge next. We'd spend the afternoon melting into the couch, her feet tucked under my legs, both of us pretending we understood the plot of whatever pretentious documentary she'd picked. Later, we'd drag ourselves to the farmer's market downtown, acting like we cared about organic kale and artisanal honey, when really, and I mean really, we just wanted those free cheese samples from the Vermont vendor who never asked questions and had the good stuff. Those Saturdays felt like home, like safety, like the kind of comfortable rhythm you build with someone over years of choosing them every single day. But then something shifted, and it happened so gradually I didn't even notice at first. She started saying she needed me time. Not in a demanding way or anything hostile, just casual mentions here and there. "I think I need some me time this weekend," she'd say, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone like it was the most natural thing in the world. And look, I'm not some Neanderthal who thinks wives exist solely for my entertainment. Everyone needs to recharge their batteries, decompress, do whatever the self-care blogs say you're supposed to do to avoid becoming a rage-filled zombie. So I said, sure, absolutely, take all the time you need. I'm a supportive husband. I'm evolved. I read articles about emotional labor and everything. Except some me time became every single weekend without fail. Every Saturday, like clockwork, she'd announce her need for solitude and disappear for hours. I started calling it National Alone Day in my head, except the joke wasn't funny because the only person actually alone was me, sitting on our couch, watching shows by myself and eating cereal for dinner like some divorced sad sack, which, spoiler alert, I basically already was without knowing it. I'd text her casual things like, "Want me to save you some Thai food?" And she'd respond with, "Already ate, thanks," with an exclamation point that felt aggressive in its cheerfulness. Who the hell was she eating with? Where was she going? These questions started as tiny whispers in the back of my mind, but eventually grew into full-volume screaming. The thing about being the person left behind is that you start noticing everything, and I mean everything. Suddenly, you're aware that she's doing her hair differently, that she bought new workout clothes, even though she's supposedly going to the same gym she's been going to for 3 years, that she's humming songs you've never heard while making breakfast. You become a detective in your own home, examining clues you wish you'd never found, piecing together a puzzle you'd rather leave incomplete. I'd catch myself staring at her while she got ready to leave, watching her apply mascara in the bathroom mirror with the door halfway open, and I'd think, when did she start wearing mascara to the gym? But I didn't say anything, because saying something would make it real, would force a conversation I wasn't ready to have, would potentially blow up the entire life we'd built together. So instead, I stayed quiet and told myself stories. Maybe she really did need time alone. Maybe I was being paranoid and insecure. Maybe marriage was supposed to feel like this after a while, comfortable enough that you didn't need to spend every waking moment together, mature enough to pursue separate interests and maintain individual identities. All those stupid articles I'd read about healthy relationships talked about the importance of independence and not being codependent and giving each other space to grow. So maybe, just maybe, this was what growth looked like. Maybe I was the one with the problem for wanting us to still act like we did in year one, when we couldn't keep our hands off each other and spent entire Sundays in bed talking about nothing and everything. But deep down in that gut-level place where you know things before your brain catches up, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. You can feel it in the way someone kisses you, or doesn't. In the way conversations become shorter and less frequent. In how "I love you" transforms from a feeling into an obligation, something you say before hanging up the phone. Not because you're overwhelmed with emotion, but because it's what married people are supposed to say. Our marriage had become a performance we were both tired of rehearsing. Except I was still trying to remember my lines while she'd apparently found a whole new script with someone else. I remember one Saturday morning specifically, about 3 months into her weekly disappearing act, when I made blueberry pancakes from scratch, the real deal, with buttermilk and everything, not that box mix garbage. I even cut up fresh strawberries and whipped cream, because I'm not some animal who serves plain pancakes. She came downstairs already dressed in her gym clothes, hair pulled back, smelling like that expensive perfume she usually saved for date nights we'd never had anymore. "You're not staying for breakfast?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and not accusatory, not desperate. She glanced at the pancakes, then at her watch, then at me with this apologetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rain check," she said. "I really need to get going." And then she was gone out the door before I could even respond, leaving me standing in our kitchen with a plate full of cooling pancakes and the growing realization that I was slowly, painfully losing my wife to something or someone I couldn't see. That's when I stopped calling it National Alone Day and started calling it what it really was: the beginning of the end of everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my wife, and my own ability to recognize when I was being played for a complete and total fool. At first, I genuinely thought she'd joined some kind of secret spa cult, the kind where they convince middle-class women that spending $200 on a hot stone massage is investing in yourself, and that drinking overpriced kombucha makes you spiritually enlightened. I pictured her in one of those fluffy white robes, cucumber slices on her eyes, whale sounds playing in the background, while some person named Crystal with healing hands told her to release her toxins or whatever the hell they say in those places. It seemed plausible, honestly. She'd leave around noon every Saturday, always with this little wave and a promise that she'd be back later, which is the vaguest word in the English language and should be illegal in marriage contracts. Then she'd roll back home sometime after dark, usually around 9 or 10, smelling faintly of lavender and what I can only describe as guilt, though at the time I didn't have a name for that particular scent. I told myself she was decompressing from the week, maybe journaling about gratitude and self-love and all those buzzwords that Instagram therapists throw around like confetti. God knows her job was stressful. She worked in marketing for a company that sold organic dog treats to people with more money than sense. And apparently convincing rich people that their golden doodles needed grain-free biscuits took a psychological toll. So yeah, maybe she needed those Saturdays to herself. Maybe I was being the stereotypical clingy husband who couldn't handle his wife having a life outside their marriage. Maybe I needed to check my own insecurities and be more supportive. I actually said these things to myself out loud while washing dishes alone on Saturday nights, like some kind of self-help podcast playing in my own head. But then I started noticing things, little things that didn't quite add up, like when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle and you find a piece that's clearly from a different box entirely. The car mileage was the first real red flag that smacked me across the face. I'm not proud of this, but one Saturday after she left, I went out to check something in the garage and happened to glance at the odometer in her car. happened to glance, right? Who am I kidding? I specifically walked out there to look because my gut was screaming at me, and I needed something concrete to either validate or dismiss this growing paranoia eating away at my insides. The mileage read 15 miles more than it had that morning. 15 extra miles! Our gym, the one she'd been a member of for 3 years, the one with the fancy eucalyptus towels and the smoothie bar, was exactly 4 miles away. 4 miles there, 4 miles back, that's 8 miles total. Unless the treadmill had somehow developed wheels and relocated to the next county, something wasn't adding up, and the math wasn't mathing, as the kids say. I stood there in our garage for probably 10 minutes, just staring at those numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something innocent and explainable. Maybe she'd driven to the grocery store afterward, except we had plenty of food and she never came home with bags. Maybe she'd gone to get gas, but the tank was still 3/4 full. Maybe she'd taken a scenic route because she needed to clear her head and driving helped her think. Except my wife hated driving and complained about gas prices constantly, so taking an unnecessary 7-mile joyride seemed wildly out of character. Every explanation I invented felt flimsier than the last, like trying to build a house out of wet tissue paper. Then came the Saturday that really sealed the deal, the one where all my suspicions crystallized into something I could no longer ignore or explain away with mental gymnastics. She came downstairs that morning wearing red lipstick. And I'm not talking about some subtle nude shade or a light pink tint that could pass for natural. I'm talking full-on stop traffic, look at me red. The kind of red that says, I have plans and you're not invited to them. She was also wearing this black athletic outfit I'd never seen before, the kind that looked more like it belonged on a fitness influencer's Instagram than someone going to casually use an elliptical machine. Her hair was styled, actually styled, with product and effort. And she'd put on perfume. Perfume to go sweat on a Stairmaster surrounded by divorced dads and college kids on winter break. "You're going to the gym like that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual and not accusatory, even though inside I was screaming. She turned and smiled at me, this bright, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "Confidence boost." Just like that. Confidence boost, as if the explanation was perfectly reasonable and I was weird for questioning why someone needed bright red lipstick and designer workout clothes to run on a treadmill in a fluorescent lit room that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. "Confidence boost," she repeated, grabbing her keys and her water bottle, a new stainless steel one I'd never seen before, because apparently everything in her life was getting upgraded except our marriage. Yeah, sure, I thought as the garage door closed behind her. Confidence boost. Because nothing says I'm working on my self-esteem like dressing up for a stationary bike. Apparently, dumb husbands had become the new self-care accessory, and I was wearing the title like a participation trophy I never asked for. I watched her car pull out of the driveway, that familiar silver sedan I'd helped her pick out 3 years ago when her old one finally died, and I felt something shift inside me. Not quite anger yet, more like resignation mixed with this creeping dread that I'd been living in denial for months, maybe longer. The rest of that day I spent Googling things I never thought I'd Google. Phrases like, signs your wife is cheating, and how to tell if your spouse is lying, and am I paranoid or right, which yielded about 10 million results, because apparently I wasn't alone in this particular brand of domestic nightmare. Every article said the same things: changes in appearance, unexplained absences, new attention to grooming, defensive behavior when questioned, decreased intimacy at home. Check, 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 and check. I was basically playing infidelity bingo and winning every round, except there was no prize, just this hollow feeling in my chest that felt like someone had scooped out my insides with a rusty spoon. When she came home that night at 9:45, I checked the time because I'd become that person now, the one who monitored comings and goings like a prison warden. She was glowing, actually glowing, like she just had the best workout of her life or discovered enlightenment, or, more likely, spent the last several hours doing something that had nothing to do with fitness equipment. The red lipstick was mostly gone, but you could see the faint stain on her lips, and her hair was slightly messed up in a way that didn't look like workout sweat, but more like someone had run their hands through it. She breezed past me in the living room, called out, "Great session today," and headed straight for the shower without making eye contact. I sat there on the couch, Netflix asking me if I was still watching for the third time, and realized that I'd become the punchline to a joke I didn't even know was being told. My wife was living an entire separate life every Saturday, and I'd been too trusting, too comfortable, too damn stupid to see it happening right in front of my face. The worst part wasn't even the lying. It was knowing that she thought I was too oblivious to notice, that she'd looked at me that morning in my old sweatpants and bedhead and calculated that I was safe to deceive, easy to fool, too wrapped up in my own comfortable bubble to question her bright red confidence boost. There's nothing scarier than catching your own reflection looking suspicious, and I mean genuinely unhinged, in a way that makes you question who you've become. I'd always been a pretty relaxed guy, the kind of person who didn't sweat the small stuff, who rolled with punches, who prided himself on being easygoing and rational, and not one of those jealous, controlling husbands you see in bad Lifetime movies. But suddenly, seemingly overnight, I transformed into Sherlock Holmes, except with crippling trust issues and significantly less heroin. I found myself doing things I never thought I'd do, things that would have disgusted past me, things that made me feel dirty and pathetic, but also oddly necessary, because what else was I supposed to do? Just keep pretending everything was fine while my marriage crumbled around me like a stale cookie? The GPS history was my first real investigative move, and let me tell you, it felt both empowering and absolutely soul-crushing at the same time. Modern cars basically track your every movement like you're a criminal on parole, which is great for finding that restaurant you went to 6 months ago, but terrible when you're trying to hide an affair. I waited until she was in the shower one Sunday morning, steam pouring out from under the bathroom door, and I grabbed her car keys like some kind of suburban spy. My hands were actually shaking as I sat in the driver's seat and pulled up the navigation history, which should have been full of addresses and timestamps that would finally give me answers, that would either confirm my suspicions or prove I was losing my mind over nothing. Except it was gone, completely wiped, empty. The screen showed absolutely nothing, like she'd never driven the car anywhere ever, like it had sat in our garage unused since the day we bought it. The history had been deleted, meticulously erased, and you don't delete your GPS history unless you have something to hide. Innocent people don't scrub their digital footprints. People going to the gym don't need to cover their tracks. The emptiness of that screen told me more than any address could have. And I sat there in her car, in our garage, feeling my stomach drop to somewhere around my feet. She knew. She knew I might check. She was being careful, calculating, which meant this wasn't some spontaneous thing or a confused moment of weakness. This was planned, ongoing, and sophisticated enough that she was taking countermeasures. I stumbled back into the house feeling like I've been punched in the throat, trying to arrange my face into something normal before she came out of the bathroom. When she emerged 10 minutes later, wrapped in a towel with her hair wet and her skin pink from the heat, she smiled at me like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just confirmed every fear I'd been harboring by virtue of what she'd deliberately hidden. "Morning," she said cheerfully, kissing my cheek as she passed. Her lips felt like ice, even though she just stepped out of a hot shower. I managed to mumble something back, but I don't even remember what, probably just some grunt that could pass for communication. The questions started that same day, casual little probes disguised as normal husband conversation. Each one a tiny test to see how she'd react. "Where were you today?" I asked that afternoon while we were both in the kitchen, her making tea and me pretending to read something on my phone. She was stirring honey into her mug, that little spoon clinking against ceramic, and she didn't even pause. "The gym," she said, blinking at me with these wide, innocent eyes like I'd asked her the color of the sky. Why? That single word hung between us, suspicious and defensive, turning my simple question into an interrogation I hadn't meant to start. I shrugged, going for casual and probably missing by a mile, just making sure you didn't join the Navy without telling me. It was supposed to be a joke, the kind of dumb husband humor I usually deployed to diffuse tension, but it landed flat. She didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just stared at me for a long moment with this unreadable expression, something between annoyance and fear, before turning back to her tea and saying, "You're being weird." And maybe I was being weird, but weird seemed like a pretty reasonable response to discovering your wife was systematically lying to you and covering her digital tracks like a mob boss. That night, I couldn't sleep, which was becoming a regular occurrence and probably taking years off my life from stress alone. I lay in bed next to her, listening to her breathe, watching the rise and fall of the blanket, and wondering who she'd been with earlier that day, wondering what they talked about, wondering if she laughed with him the way she used to laugh with me before everything got stale. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to the living room, flipping on a single lamp and just sitting there in the semi-darkness like some kind of depression commercial. Our wedding photo sat on the bookshelf across from the couch, this big 8x10 in a silver frame that her mother had given us as a gift. We looked so young in it, so stupidly happy, both of us grinning like we'd won the lottery and couldn't believe our luck. She wore white, obviously, with flowers in her hair, and I wore a suit that was too big in the shoulders because I'd lost weight from wedding stress. We were 26 and 25, respectively, convinced we'd figured out something that most people missed, that our love was different and special and immune to the statistics about divorce rates and infidelity and growing apart. Looking at that photo now felt like looking at strangers. People I used to know but didn't recognize anymore. People who had no idea what was coming. I wondered if past me, that goofy kid in the too big suit, would punch present me for letting things get this bad, for missing the signs, for being so comfortably oblivious that my wife felt confident enough to maintain an entire secret life. Or would he just hand me a drink and commiserate, acknowledging that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes people change in ways you can't predict or prevent, that marriage is just as much about luck and timing as it is about commitment and effort? Probably the drink, honestly. Past me was pretty non-confrontational. The rest of that week, I became someone I didn't recognize, someone obsessive and paranoid and constantly on edge. I checked her phone when she was in the shower. Password protected, of course, changed from the one I used to know. I looked through her emails on the computer. Nothing suspicious, which meant she was using an account I didn't know about. I even briefly considered following her one Saturday, but talked myself out of it because that felt like a line I wasn't ready to cross, a level of crazy I hadn't quite reached yet. Every interaction between us became a performance. Me pretending everything was normal while mentally cataloging every inconsistency, every strange detail, every moment that confirmed what I already knew but wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. The mirror in our bathroom became my enemy. Every morning I'd brush my teeth and catch my own reflection, looking back at me with these tired eyes and this suspicious expression. And I'd think, this is what betrayal looks like. Not dramatic or cinematic, not some big revelation with shouting and tears, but just this slow erosion of trust that turns you into a detective in your own home, that makes you question every word and doubt every explanation, that transforms casual conversations into cross-examinations. I looked older suddenly, more worn down, like I'd aged 5 years in 5 weeks. There were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before, gray hairs popping up at my temples that I swear appeared overnight, this general sense of defeat hanging over me like a cloud. She asked me once during this period if I was okay, if something was bothering me. And the irony was so thick I almost choked on it. Was something bothering me? Oh, nothing much. Just the complete destruction of my marriage and the growing certainty that my wife was cheating on me every single weekend while I sat at home like an idiot eating takeout and watching TV shows we used to watch together. But instead of saying any of that, I just smiled and said I was tired, work was stressful, nothing to worry about. Because what was the alternative? Confronting her without proof? Accusing her based on suspicions and deleted GPS history? I needed something concrete, something undeniable, something she couldn't explain away or turn around on me. So I lived in this bizarre limbo, knowing but not knowing, suspecting but not confirming, going through the motions of marriage while internally preparing for its end. And the whole time, the mirror kept showing me this stranger with suspicious eyes. And I kept wondering when exactly I'd stopped recognizing myself. My buddy Ethan, who's been divorced twice and wears it like a badge of honor he didn't want but earned anyway, said something to me about 3 weeks into my spiral that hit way too close to home. We were at a sports bar watching a game neither of us cared about, drinking beers that tasted like regret and broken promises, and I made some offhand comment about how my wife needed so much space lately. He stopped mid-sip, put his beer down with this heavy thud that made the bartender look over, and said, "Liam, let me tell you something I learned the hard way twice. If she starts saying she needs space, she's already sharing someone else's." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was telling me the score of the game or commenting on the weather. No judgment in his voice, just this tired wisdom that comes from getting burned repeatedly by the same fire. I laughed when he said it, this hollow sound that didn't reach any genuine part of me. Because what else do you do when someone verbalizes your worst fear in the middle of a Tuesday night at Hooligan's Bar and Grill? You laugh it off. You make a joke about him being cynical. You change the subject to literally anything else. But that comment burrowed into my brain like a parasite and set up permanent residence there, playing on repeat every time she walked out the door with her gym bag and her secrets. Ethan was 2 for 2 in failed marriages, sure, but maybe that didn't make him pessimistic. Maybe it just made him experienced. Maybe he could see things I was still desperately trying not to see. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. Something that felt both empowering and like a complete admission of defeat. I called Ben Harris, a lawyer whose name I'd gotten from a coworker who'd gone through a messy divorce last year and came out the other side relatively intact, at least financially. Ben had an office downtown in one of those buildings that looks like every other office building. Lots of glass and steel and the faint smell of corporate despair. I told the receptionist I needed to speak with him about a personal matter, which is apparently code for my marriage is imploding and I need professional help, because she got me an appointment for that same afternoon without asking any follow-up questions. Ben Harris looked exactly like you'd expect a divorce lawyer to look. Gray hair styled in a way that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Expensive suit that fit perfectly. Wire-rimmed glasses that made him look scholarly and intimidating at the same time. He had this office with dark wood furniture and leather chairs and diplomas on the wall from schools I couldn't afford to visit, let alone attend. He looked like the type of guy who could draft divorce papers blindfolded while simultaneously negotiating a settlement and maybe performing minor surgery on the side. There was this aura of competence around him that was both comforting and terrifying, because hiring Ben Harris meant this was real, meant I was actually considering blowing up my entire life based on suspicions I couldn't yet prove. I sat down in one of those leather chairs that probably cost more than my first car and tried to explain my situation without sounding like a paranoid lunatic. "I think my wife is cheating on me," I said. And hearing the words out loud made my chest feel tight, made the whole thing suddenly concrete instead of just theoretical. Ben didn't react, didn't show surprise or sympathy or anything really, just pulled out a legal pad and a pen and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the Saturdays, the deleted GPS history, the red lipstick, the extra mileage, all of it spilling out in this rambling confession that probably made me sound unhinged. He took notes the entire time, his pen scratching across the paper in neat, organized lines while my life fell apart in messy, disorganized chunks. When I finished, he looked up at me with these sharp blue eyes and said, "You need proof." Not, "Are you sure?" or "Have you tried couples counseling?" or any of the things I half expected him to say, just straight to the point. You need proof. I must have looked confused or lost because he continued, "I believe you. Your story has all the hallmarks, and my gut says you're right. But beliefs don't hold up in court or in divorce proceedings. You need evidence. Concrete, undeniable evidence." He paused, tapping his expensive pen against his legal pad, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "Private investigator. Quiet guy, gets results. Tell him I sent you." The card was plain white with black lettering, no fancy logo or tagline, just a name, Leo Castillo, and a phone number. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than a piece of cardstock had any right to feel, like it carried the weight of every decision I was about to make. "I just wanted advice," I said weakly, though we both knew that was a lie. Nobody makes an appointment with a divorce lawyer for friendly advice. You don't show up at a law office downtown because you're having minor marital disagreements. You show up because your world is ending and you need someone who's seen this movie before to tell you how it ends. Ben leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in that way lawyers do when they're about to say something you don't want to hear but need to. "Mr. Porter, you came here for a reason. Maybe you're not ready to admit it to yourself yet, but you know what's happening. The question isn't whether your wife is cheating. You already know the answer to that. The question is whether you're ready to do something about it." He was right, of course. I'd known since the red lipstick, maybe even before that. I'd just been too scared or too comfortable or too whatever to fully acknowledge it. I left his office with the business card burning a hole in my pocket and this strange sense of relief mixed with dread. Relief because I'd finally taken action, because I wasn't just sitting around waiting to be made a fool of anymore. Dread because there was no going back from this, because calling Leo Castillo meant setting wheels in motion that would inevitably lead somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. The elevator ride down felt like descending into a different version of my life. One where I was a man who hired private investigators and consulted divorce lawyers instead of a guy who made pancakes on Saturday mornings and believed in happy endings. That's how I met Leo 3 days later in a diner on the east side of town that looked like it hadn't been renovated since 1987 and smelled like bacon grease and broken dreams. I'd expected someone out of a noir film, trench coat, fedora, maybe a cigarette dangling from his lips, and a world-weary attitude. What I got was the most unbothered man I've ever encountered in my entire life. Sitting in a corner booth wearing cargo shorts, a Hawaiian shirt, and honest-to-God Crocs. Crocs. The man I was hiring to potentially catch my wife cheating was wearing rubber clogs with holes in them, like he'd just come from a backyard barbecue or a very casual beach wedding. "You, Liam?" he asked when I approached, not standing up or offering to shake hands, just looking up at me with these calm brown eyes that had probably seen every variation of human betrayal imaginable. I nodded and slid into the booth across from him, suddenly feeling overdressed in my jeans and button-up shirt. There was a piece of lemon meringue pie in front of him, about half-eaten, and he took another bite before gesturing for me to talk. "Ben says you need surveillance," he said around the mouthful of pie, completely unfazed by the situation or the fact that he was currently eating dessert at 10 in the morning. I explained everything again, my third time recounting this particular nightmare, and it got a little easier each time, like I was building up immunity to my own pain through repeated exposure. Leo ate his pie and listened, occasionally nodding, but mostly just chewing thoughtfully, and I genuinely couldn't tell if he was paying attention to my marital crisis or just really focused on his dessert. When I finished, he pushed the empty plate aside, pulled out his own phone, and started typing notes with his thumbs like a teenager texting their friends. "I'll handle it," he said simply, not looking up from his screen. "Give me 3 weeks. I'll follow her Saturdays, document everything, get you what you need." "That's it?" I asked, expecting more questions or maybe some kind of contract or discussion of payment or literally anything more formal than a guy in Crocs saying he'd handle it. Leo finally looked up at me and smiled, this small, knowing smile that somehow made me feel like everything would be okay, or at least like I'd hired someone competent despite all evidence to the contrary. "That's it," he confirmed. "I'll email you updates. Don't call her. Don't confront her. Don't do anything different. Act normal. Let me do my job." He stood up, dropped cash on the table for his pie, and walked out of the diner without another word, leaving me sitting there wondering if I'd just hired a genius or made the worst decision of my life. I genuinely couldn't tell if he meant he'd handle the case or if he just really handled that lemon pie, but I guess I was about to find out. 3 weeks later, I got a thick manila envelope slid under my office door like some kind of ominous pizza delivery. Except instead of pepperoni and cheese, it contained photographic evidence of my wife's betrayal and the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. There was no note attached, no warning text, no phone call to prepare me. Just this fat envelope sitting on my carpet at 7:30 in the morning when I arrived at work, bulging with secrets I'd paid someone to uncover, but wasn't actually ready to see. Just vibes, as my younger coworkers would say. Except these were terrible vibes, the kind that make your stomach drop and your hands shake, and your brain immediately start bargaining with the universe for a different reality. I stood there staring at it for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds. My coffee getting cold in my hand, my heart doing this weird arrhythmic thing that couldn't possibly be healthy. Part of me wanted to leave it there, just step over it and go about my day pretending it didn't exist. Schrodinger's envelope of infidelity, existing in a state where my marriage was both destroyed and intact until I actually opened it and collapsed the quantum waveform. But that's not how real life works, unfortunately. You can't just ignore evidence because it's inconvenient or painful or going to fundamentally alter your entire existence. So I picked it up, felt the weight of it, easily 50 or 60 photos based on the thickness, and walked into my office on legs that felt like they'd been replaced with jello. I sat at my desk, placed the envelope in front of me like it was a bomb I needed to defuse, and just breathed for a minute. My office suddenly felt too small, too quiet, the fluorescent lights too bright and too revealing, like they were illuminating not just the room, but every naive assumption I'd made about my marriage. The envelope had my name written on it in block letters. Nothing else. Completely anonymous, and yet deeply personal in a way that made me feel exposed. Through the window, I could see Barbara from accounting walking past with her morning bagel, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world was about to implode 3 feet away from her. Life just keeps going, I guess, even when yours is ending. I opened it. Inside were photographs, probably 60 of them if I had to guess, all neatly organized with timestamps printed in the corner like evidence in a criminal trial, which I suppose this kind of was. My wife. A man. A black SUV. Various locations. Each photo was crystal clear, professional quality, the kind of shots that left absolutely zero room for misinterpretation or alternative explanations. Leo and his Crocs had delivered exactly what he'd promised, and I suddenly understood why Ben had recommended him despite his questionable fashion choices. This wasn't some grainy cell phone picture taken from far away that could be explained as coincidence. This was high-def proof, damning and irrefutable. I flipped through them like flashcards of heartbreak, each one a tiny knife finding a new place to stick. There she was getting into his SUV, laughing at something he'd said. There they were at a coffee shop I didn't recognize, sitting way too close, her hand on his arm in a way that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. There was one of them walking into what looked like a hotel, and my brain tried very hard not to compute what that meant, even though it was painfully obvious. Another showed them in his car, and even through the windshield you could see how she looked at him, animated, alive, present in a way she hadn't been with me in months, maybe years. But the one that hit the hardest, the one that made my coffee taste like ash and my chest feel like someone had reached in and squeezed, was a photo of her smiling. Just smiling. Nothing dramatic or explicitly romantic. Just her face captured in a moment of genuine happiness. Except it was a smile I recognized because it used to be mine. The kind of bright, unguarded expression she'd give me when I'd surprise her with her favorite takeout or make a joke that actually landed. That smile belonged to our early years, to Saturday morning pancakes and lazy Sunday afternoons, to a version of us that apparently no longer existed. And now some other guy was getting it, was probably getting all the best parts of her, while I got the tired scraps and the elaborate lies. The timestamps mocked me with their consistency and their cruelty. Every single Saturday between 4 and 7 p.m., like clockwork, like a standing appointment on her calendar. The gym translated to a 3-hour date with someone whose face I could now see clearly in high definition. He wasn't particularly handsome. That somehow made it worse. Just average looking, probably around her age, the kind of guy you'd pass on the street without a second glance, which meant she hadn't left me for someone objectively better or more attractive. She'd left me for someone who probably just paid attention to her, who made her feel seen, who didn't take her for granted the way I apparently had. I found myself staring at one particular photo until my vision went blurry and my coffee went from lukewarm to completely cold. It showed them sitting on a park bench, her head tilted toward him, his arms stretched behind her on the bench back, in that casual, possessive way that says, "We're together," without actually touching. The timestamp read 5:47 p.m. on a Saturday 3 weeks ago. I remembered that Saturday specifically, because when she'd come home, I'd asked how her workout was, and she'd said, "Great, really pushed myself today," with a straight face. And I believed her, because I was still clinging to the delusion that my wife wouldn't look me in the eye and lie. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to pick it up. Ben Harris's number already pulled up from my recent calls. It rang twice before he answered with his professional lawyer voice, probably expecting a client with a standard legal question, not a man whose entire existence had just been validated and destroyed simultaneously. "Let's move forward," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant, like it was coming from someone else entirely. Someone who had their shit together and knew what they were doing, instead of a guy whose hands were literally trembling while holding evidence of his wife's affair. Ben paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the sounds of a functional office where people did normal work and didn't have their lives falling apart in real time. "You sure?" he asked. And there was something in his tone that wasn't quite sympathy, but maybe understanding. The voice of someone who'd guided countless people through this exact moment and knew the weight of what came next. He was giving me one last chance to back out, to shove the photos back in the envelope and pretend I'd never seen them, to choose willful ignorance over painful truth. "Ben, I've been sure since she wore perfume to the gym," I said, and saying it out loud crystallized something inside me, turned all that suspicion and paranoia and denial into cold, hard resolve. I was done being the clueless husband. I was done making excuses for behavior that had no excuse. I was done eating cold lasagna and pretending it was still good. I want to proceed with the divorce, draw up the papers. Let's end this before I waste any more of my life on someone who checked out of our marriage months ago. There was another pause, longer this time, and then Ben's voice came back, all business. "I'll have everything ready by Monday. We'll file on grounds of adultery, which in this state affects asset division and can expedite the process. Do you want to pursue any specific arrangements regarding property or—" He kept talking, laying out options and procedures and legal strategies, but I was only half listening, because I was still staring at that photo of her smiling, trying to pinpoint exactly when I'd lost her, when we'd gone from partners to strangers who shared a mortgage and a last name, but nothing else that mattered. I spent the rest of that day in my office with the door closed, telling my assistant I wasn't taking calls and to reschedule my meetings. The photos stayed spread across my desk like a morbid gallery exhibition, titled The Death of a Marriage, or maybe 60 Ways to Realize You're an Idiot. I kept picking them up and putting them down, torturing myself with details I didn't need to notice but couldn't help seeing. The way she'd styled her hair differently for him, the outfit I'd never seen her wear at home, the body language that spoke of comfort and attraction, and all the things that had evaporated from our relationship like morning dew under harsh sunlight. Around 3 in the afternoon, Ethan texted asking if I wanted to grab drinks after work. I almost said no. Almost told him I needed to be alone with my misery and my photographs and my shattered illusions. But then I thought about going home to the house I shared with someone who'd been systematically betraying me for months, about pretending everything was fine through dinner and then lying awake all night staring at the ceiling. And suddenly, a bar with a friend who'd already survived this twice sounded like exactly what I needed.
Yeah, I texted back. I'm going to need several drinks. Actually, maybe all the drinks. Is all the drinks an option? It's always an option, he replied. That kind of day? I looked at the photographs one more time, at her smile and his face, and the evidence of a secret life I'd funded with joint bank accounts and mortgage payments and grocery money. That kind of life, I typed back. Then started gathering the photos to put back in their envelope of doom. Each one a nail in the coffin of a marriage that had apparently died without me noticing until it was already decomposing. The papers were ready by Monday, exactly as Ben had promised, because apparently lawyers are the only professionals who actually meet their deadlines when your life is falling apart. They arrived in another manila envelope, though this one came via courier instead of mysteriously appearing under my door, which somehow made it feel more official and terrifying. The documents were clean, sharp, professional, like a legal haircut, all precise lines and no room for interpretation or second-guessing. Petition for dissolution of marriage, it read across the top in bold letters that might as well have said, "Your marriage is officially dead, please sign here." Grounds, adultery. It was right there in black and white. Legal terminology transforming my wife's Saturday hobby into courtroom language that stripped away all the emotion and left just the cold facts. But I didn't hand them over immediately. Didn't storm into the house waving papers and demanding explanations or confessions or whatever the scorned spouse is supposed to do in these situations. I'd seen enough movies to know that route led to screaming matches and thrown dishes and dramatic confrontations that nobody actually wins. Instead, I wanted something different. Peace, closure, maybe just one final moment of control in a situation where I'd felt powerless for months. So I waited one more Saturday, planned it out like some kind of twisted farewell performance, a final curtain call before the whole show shut down permanently. Saturday morning, I woke up early, earlier than I had in weeks, with this strange sense of purpose humming through my veins. I made her breakfast, the whole elaborate spread I used to make back when we were happy, or at least pretending to be. Scrambled eggs cooked low and slow the way she liked them. Avocado toast on that expensive sourdough from the bakery downtown. And an almond butter smoothie with bananas and honey because she was always on some health kick that I never quite understood but supported anyway. Basically, I made the forgiveness combo. The meal that in our early years would follow any argument or rough patch. The culinary olive branch that said, "I'm sorry and I love you and let's move past this." She came downstairs around 9 o'clock, hair still messy from sleep, wearing one of my old college t-shirts that had become her unofficial pajama top, and her face lit up when she saw the spread on the kitchen table. "You're sweet," she said, sliding into her chair with this genuine smile that would have melted me completely if I didn't know exactly where she'd be in a few hours. Sweet, that's what I was. Sweet, oblivious, convenient. Pick your adjective for the husband who makes breakfast while his wife plans her afternoon affair.
"You're busy every weekend," I said, keeping my voice light and casual, just making conversation while I sipped my coffee and watched her eat the eggs I'd carefully prepared. "I figured I'd feed you before you vanish again." It came out more bitter than I'd intended, a little edge creeping into my tone despite my best efforts. But she either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. She laughed, actually laughed, this carefree sound that made me want to throw my coffee mug against the wall just to hear something shatter the way my chest felt constantly shattered lately. Her eyes did that guilty twitch, though, that little micro-expression I'd become an expert at reading over the past few months. Just a tiny flicker, barely noticeable. Unless you were looking for it, and I was always looking for it now. "I appreciate it," she said, taking a sip of the smoothie and making that satisfied sound she always made when food was particularly good. "This is really thoughtful." Thoughtful, right. I was being thoughtful by preparing a last meal before serving divorce papers. Marie Antoinette would be proud. By noon, she was getting ready. The familiar routine I'd watched dozens of times now with entirely different eyes. Gym clothes that cost more than regular clothes and somehow looked better than anything in my wardrobe. Hair done carefully, makeup applied, perfume sprayed. The whole production of dressing up for exercise that I questioned so many times in my head, but never out loud. Not until it was too late and the questions didn't matter anymore. "Have a good workout?" I called out as she grabbed her keys. And she turned and blew me a kiss. Actually blew me a kiss, like we were in some romantic comedy and not a tragedy disguised as a marriage. "Love you," she said. Those two words that have become completely meaningless through repetition and insincerity, just sounds people make when leaving the house because it's expected and habitual. "You too," I replied, and watched her drive away for what I knew would be one of the last times as my wife. The garage door closed behind her, and I sat there in the sudden silence of our house, this space we'd built together that had somehow become a stage for elaborate lies and Saturday disappearances. I poured myself a glass of wine, even though it was barely past noon, because day drinking felt appropriate for the occasion, opened the manila envelope that had been sitting in my home office all week, and carried the divorce papers upstairs to our bedroom. I placed them on her pillow, right where her head would rest tonight when she came home smelling of lavender and guilt and whatever cologne he wore. It felt poetic, somehow symmetrical. She'd been sleeping next to me while betraying me, so now she could come home to papers on her pillow announcing the consequences. I stood there looking at our bed, this king-sized symbol of intimacy and partnership that had become just a place where two strangers slept facing opposite directions and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just this vast emptiness where my marriage used to be. The rest of the afternoon I spent pretending to read a book I'd bought as a joke called Emotional Stability for Dummies, which was actually pretty helpful despite being intended as humor. I learned that acceptance was the final stage of grief, and apparently I'd speedrun through all the others: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, in record time. Now I was just waiting, calm and resolved, for her to come home and discover that the oblivious husband she'd been lying to had finally woken up and decided he deserved better than being someone's safety net while they explored other options. When she walked in that night around 9:15, I was sitting on the couch in the living room with all the lights on, which was unusual because normally I'd be upstairs or in the kitchen or anywhere but positioned directly in her path, like some kind of intervention waiting to happen. I'd stationed myself there deliberately, my prop book about emotional stability sitting in my lap, opened to a random page I hadn't actually read, and I was pretending to be deeply interested in whatever wisdom it offered about maintaining your sanity when your entire world had gone sideways. She came through the door with her gym bag slung over her shoulder, hair slightly messed up in that way I now recognized as post-affair rather than post-workout, and she was humming something under her breath. Probably some song he played in his car or whispered in her ear or whatever the hell cheaters do during their 3-hour Saturday sessions. She froze when she saw me, actually physically stopped mid-step like someone had pressed pause on her entire existence. Her eyes went wide, and I watched in real time as her brain tried to calculate what was happening, why I was sitting there like that, whether this was normal or something else entirely. "What's this?" she asked, her voice doing that thing where it goes up at the end, turning a statement into a question, revealing nervousness disguised as casual curiosity. She was still standing in the entryway, one hand on the doorframe like she might need to make a quick escape, gym bag slowly sliding down her shoulder. "Go upstairs," I said calmly, gesturing toward the staircase with the book still in my other hand. "Check the bedroom." My voice came out steadier than I expected. No anger or emotion, just these simple instructions delivered like I was telling her we were out of milk or needed to pay a bill. She stared at me for a long moment, probably trying to read my expression for clues about what awaited her, then slowly set her gym bag down by the door and headed up the stairs. I could hear her footsteps on each step, that familiar creaking on the fifth one that we'd always meant to fix but never got around to, the sound getting quieter as she reached the landing and turned toward our bedroom. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. Then I heard it, a sharp intake of breath, the kind of sound people make when they've been punched in the gut or received news that fundamentally alters their reality. Footsteps coming back down faster now, almost running. And then she appeared at the bottom of the stairs, clutching the divorce papers in both hands like they might dissolve if she didn't hold them tight enough. Her face had gone completely pale, all the color drained out like someone had pulled a plug, and her eyes were doing this rapid blinking thing that meant she was trying not to cry or trying to process, or maybe both simultaneously. "Divorce papers," she said, her voice cracking on the second word, holding them up like I might not know what she was referring to, like there could be some other document on her pillow that she was confused about. Her hands were shaking, making the papers rattle slightly. This visual representation of her world tilting on its axis, the way mine had been tilted for months without her caring or noticing or giving a single damn. I nodded slowly, closing the emotional stability book with a soft thump that seemed louder than it should in the heavy silence between us. "Surprise," I said, and even I could hear the bitter edge in my voice now, all pretense of calm neutrality evaporating in the face of her shock. "You said you wanted me time. Well, this gives you a lifetime of it. Congratulations, you're free." I stood up from the couch, setting the book on the coffee table with deliberate care, and watched her face cycle through about 17 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. I can explain," she blurted out, taking a step toward me with her hand outstretched like she was reaching for a lifeline, the papers still clutched in her other hand. Her voice had gone up an octave, panic mode fully activated, and I could see her brain scrambling for an explanation that would make this okay, that would put the pieces back together, that would somehow reset us to before I knew what I knew. "Don't," I said firmly, holding up my hand to stop her approach and her words simultaneously. "Seriously, just don't. This isn't a group project where we collaborate on finding excuses. This isn't a team effort. You already failed the solo test, and there's no makeup exam." I could feel anger rising now, replacing the calm I'd carefully maintained all day, bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest where I'd been storing it for weeks. I know about the Saturdays. I know about him. I know about the black SUV and the coffee shops and the hotel and every single lie you've told me while smiling to my face. Her mouth fell open in this perfect O of shock, like a cartoon character realizing they've been caught, and the papers slipped slightly in her grip. "It's not what you think," she whispered, which had to be the most cliché thing anyone has ever said when caught cheating. Like there was some secret context that would make meeting another man every weekend for months totally innocent and explainable. "Oh, good," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm so thick you could probably bottle it and sell it. "So you're not cheating. You're just conducting an emotional field trip every Saturday, taking your feelings on a little adventure, exploring alternative relationship models without bothering to mention it to your actual husband."
I started pacing now, unable to stand still. All that stored energy from months of suspicion and investigation and pain finally finding an outlet. Please, enlighten me. Tell me what I think is happening versus what's actually happening. Because from where I'm standing, with photographic evidence and timestamps and deleted GPS history, it looks pretty clear.
She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping for air, tears starting to stream down her face in those dramatic tracks that smeared her carefully applied makeup. "Liam," she started, but I cut her off again because I'd heard enough, been lied to enough, made a fool of enough to last several lifetimes. "The papers are ready. Ben Harris is my lawyer. Maybe you've heard of him. He's excellent at divorce cases, especially ones involving adultery. You can get your own lawyer, obviously. We'll divide everything 50-50, except apparently you've already been dividing yourself 50-50 for months now, so maybe you're ahead of the game." I grabbed my jacket from the coat rack, suddenly desperate to be anywhere but in this house, having this conversation, breathing this air thick with betrayal and tears and the death of everything we'd built. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small and broken, still holding those papers like they might turn into something else if she just believed hard enough. "Literally anywhere that isn't here," I replied, opening the door and stepping out into the night air that felt crisp and clean compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside. "I suggest you read those papers carefully and sign them, or don't. Either way, we're done. This marriage ended months ago. I'm just making it official." I slept like a man who'd finally turned off a years-long alarm clock that had been going off in the background of his life. That constant low-level anxiety and suspicion and dread that had been my soundtrack for months, suddenly silenced by the simple act of taking control and making a decision. I crashed at Ethan's place that night on his couch that smelled faintly of beer and regret, but felt more comfortable than my own bed had in ages. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering where my wife really was, or what she really doing, or who she was really with. I knew now. I'd known for weeks, and more importantly, I'd done something about it instead of just marinating in my own misery and playing the role of oblivious husband. The next morning, my phone lit up around 7 with a text from her. Just 2 words that appeared on my screen while I was drinking Ethan's terrible coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime during the Reagan administration and reheated multiple times since.